Thank you, Jean, and good morning, everyone. It's a nice opportunity to visit Ireland after a gap of about 45 years was the last time I was here. And all thanks to one of your famous international entrepreneurs, Michael Ryan, or is it O'Reilly? Anyway, Ryanair. I'm here because of the coincidence rather than design that the organisation I represent decided to do a couple of detailed studies on the circular economy, precisely because of what you just heard from Paola, because the European Commission was looking at revising its circular economy policy. And the reason we did that is because ESAC was set up 15 years ago to apply the scientific knowledge in the Europe's science academies to trying to inform European dimension policy, i.e. our main target audience are the Commission and the European Parliament, and of course all the stakeholders that buzz around that particular honeypot at Brussels. The brief background was that the previous Commission had put together a fairly ambitious circular economy package, and when the Juncker Commission came in at the end of 2014, that package was suspended and a new package was promised. And our council, which represents all the national academies of science of 28 countries in Europe, decided that was worth trying to inform with a bit of scientific and economic analysis. So what we did was that we got together the National Academy of Sciences of the European Union. They nominated experts who created a working group, and we then worked very much on a circular economy issues and just looked at it from the perspective of national and social sciences. The outcome of that was the publication here, Circular Economy, a commentary from the perspectives of the natural and social sciences. That was issued just before the Commission issued its new policy, and we made several comments from the point of view of the overall system failures that comprise the linear economy and how one might try and address those and move towards a more circular economy. The points are quite detailed, and so I don't have time to go through in any particular detail, but I've just put on the screen here the contents, and you can either get the full report on the ESAC webpage or if there's spare copies over there. And some of the key messages that came from this initial assessment was that we entirely agreed that circular economy was a critical issue and one which was becoming more important as population and consumption grew, and that we cannot really continue in a sustainable way based on the linear economy. We pointed out that the linear economy was really the combination of 200 or longer years of market failure in the discipline of economics, because economics still doesn't allow prices to reflect the true societal and economic costs. And our economists on the working group thought that all you had to do was fix that, and you didn't need to have a circular economy package because the linear economy would gradually become circular if you could only include all the prices. But of course that doesn't get you to the solution, because there's been a debate of 30-40 years on how to incorporate those sort of prices into the system, and we haven't really made much progress in those 40 years. We looked at a number of other systemic problems, and particularly the issues of corporate innovation and consumer behaviour and expectations, which actually are becoming more of a barrier as we innovate rather than less of a barrier. And we also identify some of the critical building blocks of a circular economy must include some sort of new approach to measurement and indicators, and we must get away from the perpetual drug of GDP and onto something a little more healthy. And we also need to think about circular economy for what? Is it for everything, or are there some materials which are particularly sensitive and need to have priority? And that led us into a second stage of reports, which in which we also called on the working group members. And I put this up here today because you see the Royal Irish Academy did nominate a very excellent contributor to our expert group, Geraldine Cusack, and I'm glad to say she's here today. Geraldine? Oh, over there, okay. She worked very hard along with the other expert members to produce these second two reports. One was on indicators. Now, if you have a new economic paradigm, you have to have some way of measuring it, so the Commission recognises that indicators are critical to the circular economy. They also recognise that current band of economic indicators do not provide that capability. So we looked upon this from first principles, applied from scientific rationality to it, and we thought about what are we trying to do. We're not starting with a clean slate, we're starting with an indicator and a family of indicators all around GDP, which has been embedded into the society's economic bloodstream for like 50, 70 years, even though the original designer of GDP said you shouldn't do that because it's full of holes. There's been a huge effort over the last 20, 30, even longer. Robert Kennedy, I think, was quoted as saying GDP measures everything except that which is worth living for. And so we're not starting from a clean slate. So we looked at GDP, we looked at all the efforts to find alternatives, and then we looked at other indicators that are around in order to see, well, what is most suitable for a circular economy. These are just some of the GDP indicators which have been put forward over the last decade or more, and I'm not going to go into them, but you'll see there's already 10 or 15 alternatives there, none of which have yet succeeded in persuading politicians and economists that they're worth actually taking any notice of. We've got this whole issue, which Paolo mentioned, which is coming in, of the Sustainable Development Indicator, Sustainable Development Goals. They in turn need indicators, so they are producing their own set of new indicators coming out. If you look at a long history of indicators in different fields, you'll find a whole range of indicators associated with sustainable development, the environmental indicators, material flow, societal behaviour, organisational behaviour, economic performance. So even though you might think you need to start thinking about new indicators for the circular economy, you're really starting from a huge plethora of indicators already available. So the key point is to figure out what makes one of those indicators or a group of those indicators particularly relevant to the circular economy. Well, the Commission have far more staff than we do, and so we weren't going to actually come out with the definitive list, but we thought we would actually provide some principles on which we would recommend to the Commission that they consider these in defining indicators. We say the bottom line for a new indicator is that it must be effective, it must be an essential part of policy, so it's no good just having an indicator which is not linked with some policy objective. So we do encourage the Commission to think about that issue throughout. We don't need simple indicators. There's a tendency just to find an indicator which you know is there already, so you can just put another label on it and say, okay, that's job done. We need indicators which are intelligent and actually well thought out and don't give wrong signals or have unintended consequences. One of the key things with circularity and economy, it does require cooperation and mindset changes amongst the whole population. It means whole organisations have to change their mind, individuals have to change their mind. So indicators need to have an incentive role. They need to have a stimulating role. They need to actually be able to communicate something to the people, the stakeholders, who have to change their behaviour or maintain their good behaviour. So indicators need not to be something which is in the annex of a statisticals handbook. They need to be something which a newspaper will put on the front page. and saying, this year's indicator is this, and it's great because. Then we have other factors going. We reviewed indicators in use in China and Japan, and we could point to some indicators which are already well tested and already deployed in some other countries. So we identified a number of options for indicators, and as Paola mentioned, that is one of the work in progress in the Commission, which will be out this year, and we'll be very interested in the outcome and how far they comply with the suggested criteria we volunteered. Indicators are important, but the second key issue was what we call critical materials. There have been critical materials discussed for a long time, and the Americans had critical materials debates in the 1960s and 1970s about either critical to national economic performance or defence performance. But under the circular economy, the critical materials has got a slightly different tinge. It really reflects the fact that with the advances in technology and our dependence on particular industries, they have become increasingly dependent on relatively small quantities of relatively rare elements, or sometimes expensive, sometimes difficult to obtain. These are the transition elements, and the ones in the middle of that periodic table when you did your chemistry you could never remember. But they all, through technological development, have become very important components of our leading new technology industries, particularly low carbon and particularly ICT, information communication technologies. And these are ones which are not produced in the EU. They're all imported, and potentially disruption of their supply could have major economic implications for whole sectors, automotive, ICT, energy and such. So the question is, this is a subset of the circular economy. There's some special factors. There's many different factors involved there than making sure concrete from a construction site is recycled more effectively. So that second report, which again is over there and on our webpage, looked at that particular aspect. So what is special about critical materials? How do we select what is a critical material, and what criteria do we use? Well, the Commission has commissioned the Joint Research Centre to look at the criticality according to some criteria of availability of supply, the stability of the main sources. In other words, are you getting it from one particular country who has a despotic dictator who may get overthrown at any one time and supply cut off? And also things like substitutability, how easy it is to do a switch from that material to another if you have to, and also the economic impacts of a disruption in supply. You know, if you could no longer get your necessary supplies of indium or pricey aluminium, what would be the economic impacts? And so we looked at some of those from first principles. We totally agreed with the criteria which the Commission had already adopted, but we thought there were a few things which needed to be factored in addition. Some of those materials are extremely environmentally damaging outside the EU, and so we thought that factor should be considered. We also had a lot of geological knowledge on the group, which actually said we are actually going to be scarce on some of these materials through basic geological availability, and therefore we should factor that. We also looked at what can we do to improve recycling rates, where we do have to come up against this basic problem we've already heard about, supply of the necessary feedstock from end-of-life goods. We found that was particularly inefficient in the EU. We need a lot of attention to eco-design to actually make it easier to recover materials at end of life, and we address that issue from like a system point of view. And I don't have time to go into details, but taking into account the metallurgical interactions of many of the critical materials with some of the base metals, this is what we call the web of metals. You can't just decide to increase one without having implications on other. And another is the complexity of the actual recovery part. One thing that does come out of that is that the complexity of extracting critical materials from an end-of-life consumer good is extremely inefficient. What you're trying to get is like 0.5% of that mass in some useful form. And that reminds one that one really needs in a circular economy to try and improve the efficiency and lifetime that we use these materials. Because even if you have end-of-life recycling, it's still only extracting a very small value. So I'll be happy to answer questions and conclude that presentation. Thank you.